The moment Richard Hale's eyes met the baby's, everything he denied came crashing down. A billionaire who thought his secrets were safe, a maid who carried the weight of truth, and a child that would unravel them both. What no one expected was how far the lie would go. Let me ask you, if the truth could destroy everything you built, would you bury it, or face it head-on? Before we jump in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what kind of story do you crave next? Drop your answer in the comments below. If stories like this grip your heart and refuse to let go, well, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've got another powerful story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now let's get into today's story. He wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. Or so he thought. Richard Hale was the kind of man whose name carried weight in every room he entered, the kind of man who never had to wait in line, never had to explain himself, never had to apologize. People didn't just respect him, they feared him, envied him, and in some twisted way, adored him. His empire stretched across industries like a golden web, his signature etched into skyscrapers, his influence woven into politics and philanthropy. He was a symbol of power in its most intoxicating form. But here's the thing about power. The higher it lifts you, the easier it becomes to believe you're above the rules, above morality, above consequence. Richard lived by one unspoken creed. Everything could be bought, everyone had a price, and nothing, not loyalty, not truth, not even love, was sacred. And for years, that belief seemed to serve him well. Imagine a sprawling estate on the edge of the city, gates that groaned open to reveal manicured gardens, a mansion dripping with chandeliers and marble floors polished so smooth they reflected your face. Staff moved through the halls like shadows, unseen, unheard, existing only to ensure Richard never felt discomfort. To the outside world, his life looked flawless, enviable. But behind those gilded doors, cracks were already forming, hairline fractures in the facade that one day would split wide open. Richard Hale was a man who thrived on control. He liked knowing that every meeting, every deal, every smile was calculated. He liked the performance of it all, the way people leaned in when he spoke, the way they laughed a little too hard at his jokes, terrified of offending him. He liked the hush that followed his arrival, as though the air itself bowed to him. And yet, in that silence, he felt something else too. An emptiness. What no one outside those walls knew was that Richard's empire had been built not only on brilliance and ambition but also on shadows, secrets tucked neatly behind boardroom smiles, betrayals hidden under contracts, and choices he pretended never happened. He could silence business rivals, he could bury scandals, but there are some truths no amount of wealth can smother. And he was about to learn that the hard way. Because the one thing Richard underestimated wasn't a competitor or a rival tycoon. It wasn't the stock market or politics. It was something far smaller, far quieter, and far more dangerous, a young woman who worked under his roof. She wasn't meant to matter to him. To Richard, she was supposed to be invisible, just another pair of hands dusting surfaces, another shadow in the mansion he barely noticed. But sometimes, invisibility is what makes a person truly powerful. You stop watching them, you stop guarding yourself, and before you know it, they've seen the side of you no one else ever will. This story begins in those gilded halls, with Richard at the height of his reign, believing he could bend the world to his will, blind to the storm already gathering in the quiet corners of his life. The storm had a name. Her name was Mariah Johnson. And though she moved through his house unnoticed, her presence would one day unravel everything he thought he knew about power, about love, and about himself. But that part comes later. For now, picture Richard Hale at the top of the world, sipping expensive scotch in a study lined with leather-bound books, unaware that the empire he'd spent a lifetime building wasn't about to be torn down by a boardroom betrayal or a hostile takeover. No, it would crumble because of a secret so intimate, so deeply human, that even he couldn't bury it. And the first step toward that downfall? It starts here, with a man who thought he was untouchable, and the dangerous lie that power whispered into his ear, that the rules didn't apply to him. Enter Mariah Johnson, the maid, quiet, hard-working, overlooked. She slipped through the mansion like a ghost, her hands polishing away fingerprints that weren't her own, her presence acknowledged only when something wasn't done fast enough. To Richard, she was invisible, until she wasn't. And that invisibility? It became her shield, and her curse. Mariah had grown up knowing her place in other people's homes. Her mother had been a maid before her, and her grandmother before that. Generations of women bent over laundry and dishes, scrubbing floors that never belonged to them. Yet Mariah carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity, a determination that refused to be swallowed by the marble and chandeliers surrounding her. Behind her modest uniform, behind her lowered eyes, lived a fire that no one cared to notice. But life inside Richard Hale's estate was unlike any house Mariah had worked in before. There was a weight in those halls, a performance that never ended. Every staff member knew that Richard didn't just demand work, he demanded silence. He wanted the illusion that his wealth made the house run itself, as though no human effort touched his perfect world. That illusion gave him power. And for a long time, Mariah played her role perfectly. Yet something shifted the first time Richard actually looked at her. It was fleeting, almost accidental. He passed her in the hallway late one night after returning from a gala, his tie loosened, his usual mask of control softened by alcohol. For a brief second, his eyes met hers. Not as a boss looks at an employee, but as a man sees a woman. And in that second, something dangerous sparked. Mariah noticed it. She always noticed the details others missed, the way his hand tightened around his glass, the subtle pause in his stride, the quick glance he tried to disguise as nothing. Most women would have turned away, buried the moment under fear or propriety. But Mariah didn't. Not because she wanted his attention, but because she understood what it meant. That look was power-shifting, tilting, slipping. For the first time, Richard Hale had allowed himself to see her. And invisibility? Once lost, it can never be reclaimed. From that night on, Richard began noticing her in ways he hadn't before. The faint hum of her voice when she worked, the way her laughter, rare but bright, cut through the heavy silence of the house. He began lingering in rooms longer than necessary, letting his eyes rest on her as though studying something forbidden. And Mariah, caught between survival and defiance, felt the walls around her life begin to thin. She told herself to stay guarded, to keep her head down, to remember that men like Richard saw women like her as disposable. But deep down, she knew she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't fully control. She didn't know yet that her invisibility, once a shield, would soon become the very curse that bound her to him in ways neither could escape. Because Richard Hale was a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. And when he decided to want her, it wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the beginning of a story that would shatter both of their lives. What do you think? Could you have stayed invisible in her place, or would you have met his gaze too? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious. A forbidden night. It wasn't planned, not even imagined, but sometimes the most dangerous choices are the ones that happen in silence, without warning. Desire collides with loneliness in the mansion's shadows, and the walls that had kept them apart suddenly seemed thinner, weaker, almost fragile. One mistake. That wasn't really a mistake. It began after another one of Richard's long evenings, another banquet where his presence was paraded like a trophy. He returned home late, weary of the handshakes and false laughter, desperate for something real in a world made entirely of performances. Mariah was still awake, finishing chores no one else cared to notice. Their paths crossed in the dim light of the kitchen, the hour so late it felt stolen from time itself. He spoke first. A simple comment about how late she worked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Not the commanding tone of a master addressing staff, but the voice of a man stripped of his armor. And Mariah, against every instinct, responded. They talked, small words at first, nothing remarkable. But in the quiet of that cavernous house, each sentence felt like it carried more weight than it should. There was a pause when their eyes met, a silence thick enough to swallow reason. Richard reached for a glass of water, his hand brushing hers by accident, or maybe not by accident at all. She felt the warmth of his skin, a fleeting contact that should have meant nothing. Yet in that instant, it meant everything. The line they'd both sworn to themselves not to cross was suddenly visible, and trembling. Mariah knew the risk. She knew what people like him did to women like her, how easily affection could turn to cruelty, how quickly promises could dissolve into denials. But she also knew what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, after a lifetime of invisibility. And Richard, he wasn't looking at her as a maid anymore. He was looking at her as if she carried the answer to an ache he couldn't name. The air between them thickened, charged, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. When Richard leaned closer, she could have turned away, stepped back into the safety of distance. Instead, she froze. She let the moment stretch, let the pull of it take hold. And when his lips finally met hers, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was the collision of two people who should never have touched, yet couldn't stop themselves. 4 hours, the world outside those walls ceased to exist. In the privacy of that night, power didn't feel like power. Wealth didn't feel like wealth. It was just two people, lonely in different ways, finding a fleeting refuge in each other. But the danger of forbidden nights is that dawn always comes, and when it does, nothing looks the same. When morning light spilled across the marble floors, Mariah understood the weight of what had happened. She carried both fear and longing inside her chest, knowing this moment would follow her long after the echoes of it faded. And Richard? He stared at the ceiling in silence, already rehearsing the lies he'd need to tell himself. Because the truth is this: one night can change everything. One night can unearth secrets, forge bonds, and ignite consequences no amount of wealth or denial can ever erase. Pregnancy. The word itself carried a weight that Mariah felt long before she ever whispered it aloud. It began with mornings spent fighting waves of nausea, nights where exhaustion clung to her bones, small shifts in her body she couldn't explain away. At first, she tried to convince herself it wasn't real, that the late cycle and dizzy spells were stress, not life forming inside her. But deep down she knew. Every passing day tightened the truth around her like a rope she couldn't loosen. She was carrying Richard Hale's child. When she finally gathered the courage to tell him, she did so in private, standing in the shadow of his study, hands trembling, voice breaking on the confession. His response wasn't shock. It was fury, sharp, immediate, and merciless. Richard erupted like a man betrayed by his own shadow. He denied her words before they fully left her lips, his face twisting with contempt. "You're lying," he spat, his voice echoing off the polished wood panels. "You want money, don't you? That's what this is about." Mariah's chest ached as she tried to steady herself. "This isn't about money," she said softly, but her words were drowned out by his rage. He stormed across the room, pulling open drawers, tossing wads of bills onto the desk as though paper could silence blood. Threats followed, thinly veiled at first, then cruel, cutting. He reminded her who he was, how easily he could erase people, how quickly lives could be destroyed when they crossed him. To Richard, the pregnancy wasn't a child. It was a scandal, a liability, a dagger aimed at the image he had crafted with such precision. His empire wasn't built to withstand whispers of betrayal, of infidelity, of a maid daring to claim a place in his legacy. And so, he did the only thing he knew: he tried to bury it under wealth. He thought money could erase blood. Mariah stood in silence, the notes fluttering across the desk like meaningless scraps. Each bill he threw felt like another wound, proof of how little he valued her, proof of how terrified he was of the truth growing inside her. She didn't touch the money. She didn't argue. She simply turned away, tears burning but unfallen, carrying within her the knowledge that no amount of denial could change what was coming. That night, Richard paced his study, scotch burning his throat, fury masking the gnawing dread beneath. Images flashed in his mind: the child's face, the eyes that might mirror his own, the scandal that would cling to him no matter how carefully he tried to hide it. For the first time in years, he felt something close to fear. Not fear of losing wealth, but fear of a truth he couldn't purchase, threaten, or silence. Mariah, in her small room tucked away at the far end of the mansion, rested her hands on her stomach, feeling the faintest flutter. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also unshakable. She wasn't carrying shame. She was carrying life. And no empire, no threats, no mountain of money could erase that fact. The seed of confrontation had been planted, and from it would grow the downfall neither of them could stop. What would you have done if you were Mariah? Take the money and disappear, or hold your ground and face the storm? Tell me in the comments. Mariah's silent suffering, her determination to keep the child, became the thread holding her together when everything else tried to unravel her. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her small, dimly lit room, she would press her palms against her stomach, feeling the faintest tremors beneath her skin. Every kick inside her belly was a truth he couldn't kill. No matter how many times Richard shouted, no matter how much money he flung in her direction, that life pulsing within her was undeniable. It was hers, and it was his. She bore the whispers of the staff with quiet resilience. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations behind closed doors, the way some avoided her as though her very presence carried scandal. Others pitied her, convinced she had ruined her future. Still, Mariah moved through those marble halls with her chin slightly lifted, determined not to bow under their judgments. She had carried heavy burdens before. This time, the burden came with a heartbeat. Richard, meanwhile, tried to bury the truth under layers of denial. He avoided her gaze, avoided the subject, avoided the growing evidence of his child with a cold determination that bordered on madness. He convinced himself that if he ignored it long enough, it would vanish, like a rumor silenced by fear. But truth waits. It always waits. Mariah's body changed with each passing week, her frame softening, her movements slowing. And with every visible shift, Richard's fury deepened. He tightened his grip on the estate, issued new orders, demanded silence from his staff, as though secrecy could strangle reality. Yet every evening when he returned home, when he caught sight of Mariah's growing stomach, the silence screamed louder than words. Still, Mariah endured. She endured his contempt, his absence, his cold stares that burned hotter than fire. She endured because she knew this wasn't just about survival. This was about legacy, about a child who deserved to exist, no matter how inconvenient their existence was for a man like Richard Hale. Sometimes, late at night, she'd think about running. She'd imagine slipping away with nothing but a small suitcase, vanishing into the world before Richard had the chance to destroy her. But every time the thought surfaced, it collided with something stronger. Resolve. If she ran, it would mean surrendering. It would mean allowing him to win, allowing him to erase her child like a stain on his perfect life. And she refused. Mariah wasn't naive. She knew the danger she was in. She knew men like Richard wielded influence that could crush people without leaving a trace. Yet with every flutter beneath her ribs, she drew strength. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It belonged to the child she carried, a child who had no voice except the one she gave them. Richard's empire might have been built on silence, but Mariah understood something he didn't. Silence isn't the absence of truth. It's the waiting room where truth grows louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. And when the day came that truth demanded to be heard, Richard would have no defense. Her suffering became her weapon, her resilience the quiet defiance he never expected. Because no matter how much power he held, he couldn't buy his way out of blood. Flashback, Richard's past, a father who abandoned him. The memory lingered like smoke that never cleared, faint yet suffocating. He was just a boy then, no fortune, no empire, no marble walls to hide behind. He remembered the night vividly, the front door slamming, his mother's cries echoing through the thin-walled house, and the sudden absence of a man who had promised to stay. The very wound he swore he'd never repeat, was repeating. History doesn't whisper, it screams. For years, Richard carried that hollow ache in silence. He despised the pitying looks from neighbors, the whispers at school that branded him the son of a man who walked away. His mother worked tirelessly, holding together what was left of their lives, but the emptiness remained. A missing chair at the table, a shadow in the corner of every memory, a voice never heard again. That loss became the furnace where Richard's ambition was forged. He vowed he would never be powerless, never depend on anyone, never allow love or weakness to dictate his life. Power became his armor, money his sword, control his sanctuary. But beneath all the wealth, the boy who once stared at the door waiting for a father who never returned still lived inside him. And now, staring at Mariah's growing belly, he saw that boy reflected back at him in the most brutal way. Each time he denied the child, each time he threw money at the problem, each time he turned his face away, he was not just silencing Mariah, he was silencing himself. He despised her for holding a truth he couldn't outrun, but what he despised more was the reminder of the man he hated most. The man who left him. The man whose shadow he was becoming. Richard drank more in those days, filling his glass as though amber liquid could drown the ghosts. Late at night, when the house fell silent, he would sit alone in his study, staring into the darkness, replaying old memories. The sight of his mother's tired face, the sound of her whispered prayers, the weight of promises broken. It all pressed against his chest until he felt suffocated. And yet, even as he drowned in bitterness, a small voice inside him whispered a truth he didn't want to hear. He was becoming the very man he had sworn to reject. He tried to silence it with rage, with threats, with money. But truth doesn't die. It waits, patient and steady, until denial crumbles. Mariah's child had not even entered the world, yet already the cycle was repeating itself. Richard had the power to stop it, to break the chain of abandonment that had scarred him so deeply. But instead of facing that choice, he ran from it, just as his father had. And with every step away, he sank deeper into the same darkness he had spent his life despising. The irony was cruel. In his desperate attempt to protect his empire, To preserve his pride, he was planting the very seed of his downfall. Because the past doesn't vanish, it bleeds into the present, staining everything it touches. And Richard Hale, the untouchable billionaire, was no exception. If you were Richard, would you confront the ghost of your past and face the truth, or keep running until history consumed you? Share your answer in the comments. Birth. It happened on a storm-soaked night, thunder cracking across the sky as if the heavens themselves were demanding to be heard. Mariah labored alone at first, her body racked with pain, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and anticipation. Hours dragged like centuries, each contraction tearing through her as though the truth inside her refused to be hidden any longer. Finally, with one last desperate cry, the world shifted. The baby arrived, and with him, undeniable proof. The midwife, summoned in secret, placed the small wriggling form against Mariah's chest. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not just from exhaustion, but from awe. The tiny hands, the steady breath, the fragile warmth pressed against her skin, it was more than survival. It was triumph. For all the denial, all the threats, all the attempts to erase him, here he was. Real. Alive. Precious. But the most haunting detail was his gaze. Even as his eyes fluttered open for the first time, they carried a familiarity that sent chills racing down Mariah's spine. Those eyes, his eyes. The same piercing shade Richard Hale saw in the mirror every morning, the same stare that silenced boardrooms and intimidated rivals. A mark no denial could erase. When Richard was finally forced to see the child, his breath caught. He hadn't expected it, had convinced himself until that moment that maybe Mariah had lied, that perhaps fate had spared him. But the instant his gaze met the infant's, every defense shattered. There, in the cradle of Mariah's arms, was proof too pure to argue against. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the face, the sharp arch of the brow, the unmistakable eyes that mirrored his own with terrifying precision. Richard's chest tightened, rage and terror colliding with something he couldn't name. It wasn't just recognition, it was exposure. His secret laid bare in the most innocent form imaginable. Mariah didn't gloat, didn't spit venom, didn't revel in the moment. She only looked at him with tired eyes, silently daring him to deny what was plain before them both. Her exhaustion wasn't defeat, it was strength, the quiet kind that needs no applause. For the first time in years, Richard found himself speechless. Money couldn't silence that gaze. Power couldn't erase it. Threats meant nothing now. He was staring at himself reborn, a reflection wrapped in fragile skin. The weight of it pressed against him like iron, and for the first time, he felt the walls of his empire tremble. He turned away quickly, but the image lingered, searing itself into his mind. The child's cry followed him down the hallway, an echo he couldn't escape. No matter how far he walked, no matter how much he drank that night, those eyes haunted him. Eyes that asked no questions, made no demands, yet condemned him more thoroughly than any jury ever could. The storm outside raged on, but inside Richard Hale's mansion, a different storm had begun. And this one, no wealth could weather. Richard seized the child again in the quiet of the following morning. The chaos of labor had passed, the storm outside had broken, and in the hush of dawn, he stood in the doorway of Mariah's room watching. He hadn't intended to come. He told himself it was curiosity, not conscience, but the sight before him pierced through every layer of armor he had built. Pride collapses into horror, denial into silence. The truth had his stare. The infant stirred in Mariah's arms, lips parting with a soft cry that seemed to echo through Richard's very bones. He stepped closer, drawn not by choice but by something primal, something undeniable. He looked down, and once again those eyes stared back at him, his own eyes, replicated with uncanny precision. No amount of denial could protect him from the reality staring upward with such fragile innocence. Richard felt his throat tighten. His instinct was to rage, to lash out, to find some way to twist this moment into control. Yet the words wouldn't come. His mouth opened, then closed. His usual dominance, the commanding voice that could silence entire boardrooms, deserted him. For once, silence claimed him completely. Mariah didn't move. Her gaze remained steady, weary but unyielding, as if daring him to speak the words he no longer had the courage to say. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She simply existed in that moment with her child, a mother shielding life against a man who wanted to erase it. Her stillness was louder than any accusation. Richard's mind raced. He saw the headlines if this truth escaped, the the billionaire with a scandal hidden under his roof, the empire threatened by whispers of betrayal. He saw the faces of his associates, his wife's cold eyes, the downfall that would follow. Yet in that whirlwind of fear, the child's eyes tethered him. They cut through his calculations, his rehearsed excuses, his desperate need for control. It wasn't just resemblance. It was recognition. For years, he had fought to bury the boy inside him who waited for a father that never came. Now that boy stared back, not from a mirror, but from the face of his own son. The weight of history crushed him, reminding him of promises broken long before this moment, promises he was now breaking all over again. He turned from the bed, gripping the doorframe as though the wood itself was the only thing keeping him upright. The silence between him and Mariah grew heavier, filling every corner of the room, pressing against his chest until he could hardly breathe. He wanted to speak, but any word he might say felt like betrayal, betrayal of his pride, his empire, his image. And so, he said nothing. But silence is its own confession. He left the room, each step slower than the last, the sound of the baby's soft cries following him down the hallway like chains he couldn't break. He thought wealth had insulated him from consequence, that power made him untouchable. Yet here in his own home, a truth so small, so fragile, had stripped him bare. If you were Richard in that moment, would silence have consumed you, or would you have spoken the words that pride wouldn't allow? Comment below. I'm listening. It started with whispers in the hallways of his company. At first, faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of paper carried on a draft. But whispers have a way of multiplying. They slip through cracks, travel faster than fire, and before long they spread from one mouth to another until even the walls seemed to hum with them. Business partners leaned too close, voices dropping when Richard entered the room, their eyes flicking sideways, betraying knowledge they weren't supposed to have. Secrets don't stay buried, they leak, drop by drop, until they flood. The staff inside his mansion had seen enough, and servants talk. One detail shared in confidence became gossip traded over kitchen counters, which in turn became rumor that spilled beyond the estate's iron gates. By the time it reached the polished boardrooms where Richard held court, the whispers had grown teeth. They weren't just stories anymore. They were accusations. Richard noticed the shift immediately. Meetings that once opened with deference now began with hesitation. Colleagues who once clung to his every word now exchanged guarded glances when he spoke. Even the silence felt charged, as if every pause was filled with questions unasked but loudly implied. His empire, once unshakable, trembled not because of financial missteps or market failures, but because of something far more dangerous: doubt. It was in the way his assistant avoided eye contact when handing him papers, in the way shareholders requested unnecessary clarifications, in the way his lawyer lingered after meetings as though waiting for him to confess. Richard's image had always been his greatest weapon, sharpened, polished, flawless. Now tiny fractures appeared, and no matter how hard he tried to patch them, everyone seemed to notice. He returned home each night more restless, more paranoid, pouring another drink to quiet the phantom voices repeating his downfall. His mansion, once a fortress, now felt like a cage. Mariah's quiet resilience haunted him in every corner, her steady presence a reminder of the child he refused to claim yet couldn't deny. Every glance at her felt like another rumor shouted in his ears. And the baby, those eyes. They followed him in dreams, stared at him across the breakfast table, mirrored him so completely that denial became a hollow ritual. Each time he saw that reflection, he felt the whispers grow louder outside his walls. How long before the world knew? How long before silence became scandal? Business associates began to test him, subtle challenges wrapped in polite tones. A question here, a raised eyebrow there. It wasn't the words that frightened him, it was the implication. They knew. Not everything, not the full truth, but enough to wound him. And for a man like Richard, perception was power. Once perception slipped, power crumbled. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire capable of swallowing competitors whole, of silencing rivals with a single phone call. Yet it wasn't a competitor that threatened him now. It was a child. A woman. A truth so simple it cut through his wealth like glass through flesh. Secrets are like storms. You can watch the clouds gather, hear the thunder rolling closer, but you can never predict the exact moment the lightning strikes. Richard felt the storm pressing down on him, and he knew when it hit, it wouldn't just scorch him. It would burn everything he'd ever built. At home his wife Eleanor noticed the strain, the late nights, the cold silences, the distance he couldn't disguise no matter how much he tried. Her eyes lingered on him at the dinner table, searching for a man who seemed to vanish a little more each day. "Why do you look at me like a stranger?" she asked one evening, her fork resting untouched, her voice steady but edged with something sharper than curiosity. Richard froze, staring at her across the long stretch of polished mahogany. His response was slow, deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Because strangers don't ask questions you can't answer." The words hung between them, brittle as glass. Eleanor tilted her head, her lips parting as though she'd push further, but instead she leaned back, her gaze heavy with suspicion. She had been married to him long enough to know when he was lying, and longer still to recognize when he was hiding. Nights became battles of silence. Richard poured himself drinks while Eleanor watched, her presence like a shadow he couldn't shake. She began noticing details he had overlooked, the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his suits, the distracted way his eyes flicked whenever children appeared on television, the way his jaw tightened when the subject of family surfaced. To a stranger, they might have been nothing. To Eleanor, they were cracks in the facade. She wasn't a woman easily deceived. Behind her grace was a calculating sharpness, a mind that had weathered years beside a man who built empires out of half-truths. And yet, this secret felt different, heavier. Eleanor's instincts whispered there was something alive inside the walls of that house, something Richard refused to name. One night, she followed him, not physically, but with her eyes, her intuition. She watched him pause outside a door at the far end of the hall, his hand hovering near the handle before pulling back. It was a pause too loaded, too fragile, to be meaningless. Eleanor stored it away like evidence. Richard could feel her watching him even when she said nothing. It was a gaze that pressed on him like a weight, daring him to crack. He longed to tell her, if only to relieve the suffocating tension, but pride and fear sealed his lips. To admit the truth would be to dismantle everything he had worked for, his marriage, his reputation, his empire. But Eleanor's silence was not submission. It was strategy. She began asking small questions that appeared innocent, but her timing was deliberate. "Why are you working so late? Who called just now? Why do you look so tired?" Each query chipped at him, each one a reminder that his secret was not as well hidden as he believed. In bed, he lay awake listening to her steady breathing, wondering if she dreamt of betrayal, if her mind already pieced together fragments of a puzzle she didn't yet have. He turned to face the ceiling, knowing the inevitable truth. Suspicion was a seed, and once planted it only grew. Eleanor wasn't just his wife, she was his equal in cunning. And Richard feared that when she finally unearthed the truth, she wouldn't confront him in whispers. She would expose him in a storm. If your partner's eyes began to pierce through your secrets, would you confess before they uncovered everything, or gamble that their silence meant safety? Drop your thoughts below. The press caught wind. Mariah spotted at the market, baby in arms. At first, it was nothing more than a grainy snapshot tucked inside a local column, easily dismissed as everyday life. But photographs have power, and when a camera caught the child's face clearly, no one could look away. The child's eyes flashing in photographs, Richard couldn't stop from spreading. They were haunting, electric, a mirror of a man who ruled boardrooms and owned headlines. And just like that, the empire wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the secret. Magazines printed the images with bold headlines that screamed scandal, while gossip sites devoured every detail like wolves. A billionaire's hidden heir? A maid's forbidden child? The story practically wrote itself, and in a world hungry for drama, it spread like wildfire. Every publication wanted a piece, every journalist craved a quote, and every click dragged Richard's empire deeper into the abyss. He tried damage control, of course. Lawyers threatened lawsuits, PR teams scrambled to spin the narrative, and hush money flowed like water. But the truth had a face now, one that couldn't be blurred or bought away. The more Richard fought to suppress the story, the more suspicious the public became. Each denial only poured gasoline on the fire. At home, Eleanor clipped the articles in silence, laying them in neat rows on her vanity like evidence in a courtroom. She didn't confront him, not yet, but her quiet preparation was far more dangerous than rage. She wasn't asking questions anymore, she was building a case. And Richard, for all his bluster, knew she was a woman who never acted without intent. Mariah, meanwhile, became a reluctant symbol. She hadn't sought attention, hadn't gone looking for revenge, but the world thrust her into the spotlight nonetheless. Cameras began following her to the grocery store, Microphones shoved at her as she tried to shield the baby from flashing bulbs. Each photo captured the boy's unmistakable features, and every image sent ripples through Richard's fortress of lies. In corporate corridors, whispers turned to outright challenges. Investors questioned his stability, shareholders threatened revolt. Contracts were delayed, deals retracted. Rivals, sensing blood in the water, circled like sharks. His empire, once untouchable, now trembled under the weight of a scandal rooted not in fraud or failure, but in flesh and blood. Richard stared at the newspapers in his office, the ink smudging beneath his trembling fingers. He wanted to tear them apart, to burn every copy, to silence every voice that dared to speak. But no fire could erase those eyes staring back at him from the page. His own eyes, undeniable, damning. He had once believed power could protect him from consequence, that money could erase mistakes. Now, with every headline, he realized he had built his empire on quicksand. And with every photograph, the ground beneath him sank deeper, pulling him toward a truth he could no longer control. Secrets can survive in silence, but the moment they step into the light, they grow wings. Richard's had taken flight, and the world was watching. Richard stormed into Mariah's small apartment, rage simmering beneath his polished suit. The building was nothing like his towering estate, its walls narrow and faded, the air thick with a scent of home-cooked meals. Yet to him, it felt suffocating, a place that had stolen his control, that had birthed the secret he could no longer bury. He slammed the door behind him, his presence consuming the room like a storm cloud. "You think you can ruin me with this mistake?" he hissed, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck pulsed. But the baby wasn't a mistake, and Mariah wasn't afraid anymore. Her eyes, once downcast when he entered a room, now lifted without hesitation, sharp with resolve. She cradled the child close, his soft breathing steady against her chest, and spoke in a voice calm enough to slice through his fury. "This isn't about you, Richard. Not anymore." Her words stung because they were true. For a man who had lived his life as the center of every universe, to be dismissed as secondary was unbearable. He paced the small living room, polished shoes clattering against scuffed floorboards, his rage pressing against the fragile walls. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he barked. "My empire is collapsing because of you. Decades of work gone." Mariah didn't flinch. "Your empire isn't collapsing because of me. It's collapsing because of you. Because you thought money could erase responsibility. Because you thought power made you untouchable." Richard froze, her words striking deeper than he expected. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as the maid he once dismissed, but as the woman who had stood against threats, against shame, against the crushing weight of his denial. She had survived his cruelty, carried life inside her, and now faced him without trembling. The baby stirred, letting out a small cry, and Richard's eyes snapped to him. For a fleeting moment, his anger faltered, replaced by something rawer, more vulnerable. The sound pierced him, cutting through the armor of pride he had built. But as quickly as it came, he shoved it down, burying it beneath years of learned control. Mariah rose from her chair, stepping closer. She wasn't reckless, she was deliberate, her every move measured, her every word chosen with precision. "You can scream, you can threaten, you can pour every dollar you have into silencing me. But no one can silence him." She glanced down at the child, his tiny hand clutching her blouse. "And no one can erase the truth written in his eyes." Richard swallowed hard, but the fury refused to fully leave him. His pride demanded he fight, demanded he reclaim control. Yet standing in that cramped room, he realized his wealth meant nothing here. Mariah held the power now, not through money or influence, but through truth. A truth that had taken root, grown strong, and no longer feared the shadow of his empire. Silence stretched, heavier than any shouting match. Richard's chest rose and fell, but he couldn't find words strong enough to strike her down. And Mariah knew it. For the first time, she had him cornered. If you were Mariah, facing a man who once controlled everything about your life, would you have stood tall or stayed silent in fear? Share below, I want to know. For the first time, she spoke of her past, scrubbing floors since childhood. Her voice didn't waver. It carried the weight of years she had endured in silence, the years that had hardened her into steel without losing her humanity. Richard stood rigid, expecting her to break under his glare, but instead she leaned into her story like a weapon sharpened long ago. "All my life, I've cleaned up after people like you," she said, her tone low but unshakable. But this? This is your mess to face. The words landed like blows he couldn't parry. For decades, Richard had dictated narratives. He was the hero, the titan, the man who bent reality to his will. But here, in this small room, the story belonged to someone he had once dismissed as invisible. Mariah's truth wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw, jagged, and undeniable. She shifted the baby in her arms, her fingers brushing the child's cheek as though to remind herself of the reason she endured. Do you know what it's like to scrub floors until your hands crack open? To be invisible in a room full of people, because they've already decided you don't matter. Her gaze locked on him, piercing through the armor he still clung to. You wouldn't, Richard. You've never lived outside the bubble of your empire. But I have. And I won't let you bury me, or him, just to save yourself. Richard's jaw worked, but no words emerged. Memories flickered in his mind, his own childhood abandonment, the years he swore he'd never become like the man who left him. And yet here he stood, accused by the very woman he had tried to erase, seeing the reflection of his father in the decisions he had made. Mariah pressed on, her voice steady, carrying the weight of decades of labor and quiet pain. I used to believe my worth was measured by how well I served others, by how spotless I made their lives while mine fell apart in the shadows. But this child changed everything. He gave me a reason to stop bowing, to stop hiding, to stop believing the lies people like you feed the world. And no matter what you try, I'll never let him grow up thinking he's a stain on your reputation. The baby stirred again, his tiny eyes glinting beneath the dim light, and Richard felt his chest tighten. Those eyes, once a curse he tried to deny, now felt like chains tethering him to a truth he couldn't escape. He looked at Mariah, standing taller than he had ever seen her, and for the first time, he recognized something terrifying. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for legacy. Richard turned away, trying to compose himself, but every corner of the room echoed with her words. This was no longer about empire, scandal, or wealth. This was about dignity, about humanity, about a child who deserved more than the shadow of shame. And though Richard wanted to cling to power, he knew in his gut that Mariah had seized something greater, moral authority. Desperation drove Richard darker, talk of lawyers, payoffs, even threats. His empire had been built on silencing opposition, on burying obstacles beneath mountains of cash and intimidation, and now he reached instinctively for the same tools. He sat in his office late into the night, scribbling figures on paper, calculating how much it would take to disappear Mariah, to hush the whispers, to make the inconvenient reality vanish like it had never existed. He imagined erasing the child from his world, erasing Mariah's voice, erasing everything that reminded him of his failure. Because fear makes monsters out of men who already believe they're gods. The thought twisted inside him, both intoxicating and repulsive. He hated that his mind could travel there, but desperation doesn't consult morality, it feeds on survival. He called his lawyers, his advisors, his most trusted fixers. Conversations blurred into veiled suggestions, relocation, sealed settlements, custody battles wrapped in gold. Some even hinted at darker measures, ones that could never be spoken aloud. Richard didn't reject them outright. And that frightened him more than the scandal itself. Across town, Mariah sensed the storm tightening. Each knock on her door made her heart race, every ring of the phone carried the weight of possible threats. Yet fear didn't paralyze her anymore, it sharpened her. She knew Richard was scrambling, clinging to the tools that had always served him, but this time, she wasn't alone. She had the truth. She had her child. And she had the eyes of the world watching. Richard's nightmares grew worse. He dreamt of his empire collapsing in flames, of faceless crowds chanting his downfall, of a child's stare burning holes into his soul. He woke drenched in sweat, staring into the darkness of his mansion, haunted by whispers that wouldn't fade. The more he plotted to silence Mariah, the louder those whispers grew, until even his own mind felt like an enemy. Still, he couldn't stop himself. Pride urged him forward, whispering lies of control. You can fix this, it told him. You can bury the truth like you always have. But another voice, quieter and more insistent, rose against it. This isn't a deal to close. This is blood. That voice unsettled him because it sounded too much like his father's absence, echoing through his own childhood. Meanwhile, Eleanor pieced the puzzle together in silence. She watched Richard's movements, tracked his late-night calls, noted the nervous tension that clung to him like smoke. She didn't lash out, she waited. Her patience was strategy, her silence a weapon. Richard thought he was orchestrating solutions, but his wife was orchestrating something else entirely: exposure. Fear gnawed at him, bending his mind into sharper corners. He couldn't admit weakness, couldn't confess the truth, because confession would mean surrender. So he hardened, let paranoia fester, and convinced himself that ruthlessness was the only path left. He didn't see that his desperation was already destroying the very empire he sought to protect. Monsters aren't born, they're carved by choices, by fear, by pride. And in those choices, Richard Hale was becoming the very thing he once despised. If you saw someone powerful slipping into darkness, would you intervene to stop them, or let them fall deeper until they destroyed themselves? Tell me in the comments. But one night, alone with the child, Richard froze. The mansion was unusually quiet, its echoing hallways stripped of voices, its vast rooms heavy with the weight of solitude. The storm of lawsuits and headlines raged outside, Eleanor's suspicions hung thick in the air, and Mariah's defiance had carved deep cracks into his pride. Yet here he was, standing in the nursery he had ordered built to disguise his guilt as charity, staring down at the boy who carried the truth of his blood. Tiny hands reached for him, not with hate, but with blind trust. And for the first time in years, he felt small. The baby's fingers curled around his, impossibly soft, impossibly certain. No accusation, no agenda, just need. Richard's chest tightened as he tried to steady his breath. This was the same child he had cursed, denied, tried to erase. Yet in that moment, denial seemed absurd. The baby didn't care about scandals, fortunes, or power. He only knew the warmth of skin, the steady beat of a heart, the presence of someone who should have been there from the start. Richard sat slowly, lowering himself into the rocking chair that had remained untouched since it arrived. The boy's gaze locked on him, those haunting eyes now shimmering with something different: innocence. He rocked gently, awkward at first, unsure of how to hold the fragile weight in his arms. The sound of the baby's breath, soft and steady, filled the cavernous silence. Memories surged. Nights of his own childhood, lying awake waiting for footsteps that never came. The bitterness he carried into adulthood, the vow he had sworn, to never abandon what his father had abandoned in him. And yet here he was, standing on the edge of repeating that very cycle. The realization carved into him like glass. Tears, foreign and unwelcome, stung his eyes. He blinked them away, furious at his own weakness. But the boy's grip tightened, as though sensing the storm within him, as though reminding him that weakness wasn't weakness at all, it was truth. He whispered words he never thought he'd speak. "What do you want from me?" The baby's only answer was a soft coo, the unspoken language of trust. Richard's heart ached. For all his power, he had never felt so powerless. Not to enemies, not to scandals, but to a child who needed nothing but love. He could feel walls collapsing inside him, the fortress he had built against vulnerability crumbling under the weight of tiny hands. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't Richard Hale the billionaire. He was just a man confronted by the reflection of his own brokenness. Still, fear lingered. Could he ever be what the child needed? Or was he doomed to fail, as his father had failed him? Pride whispered its usual poison, telling him to walk away, to preserve the empire. But another voice, quiet, insistent, rose louder: "Stay." He rocked in silence, torn between two legacies, one of abandonment, the other of redemption. And as the child drifted to sleep, his head resting against Richard's chest, the man who had ruled boardrooms with iron certainty felt the unbearable weight of choice pressing down on him. Richard broke the following evening. The weight of silence in the mansion became unbearable, pressing down on him like 1,000 unspoken truths. Eleanor's eyes followed him at every turn, steady, sharp, relentless, and Mariah's quiet strength had begun to echo through every headline, every whisper in the boardroom. He was no longer untouchable, no longer the man who controlled outcomes with a stroke of his pen. For the first time in decades, Richard felt cornered, not by rivals, not by shareholders, but by the truth he had spent months trying to bury. The confrontation began at dinner. Eleanor set down her wineglass, her gaze fixed on him, unblinking. "Richard," she said softly, though her voice carried the weight of thunder, "is there something you need to tell me?" The words cracked something open inside him. His fork slipped from his hand, clattering against the plate, loud in the stillness. He looked at her, then at his son, because that's what he was, no matter how much he had tried to deny it, being cradled by the very woman he had once dismissed as invisible. The dam shattered. His voice, usually so commanding, faltered. "It's true," he whispered, each syllable scraping raw against his throat. "He's mine. I tried to hide it, deny it, erase it. But I can't anymore." The room fell into a silence that roared louder than any argument. Eleanor's breath caught, tears welling as she searched his face for the man she once believed in. Mariah sat straighter, her jaw tightening, her eyes burning with both vindication and sorrow. Richard's hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, but the weight of years of arrogance and deceit pressed him down. He confessed not only the affair, but the fear that had driven him to cruelty, the shame inherited from his father's abandonment, the monstrous thoughts that had poisoned his mind when desperation clawed at him. He laid it bare, stripped of power, stripped of armor. Eleanor's tears spilled freely now, her silence saying more than words ever could. Her world, their world, had cracked, and she wasn't sure it could be pieced back together. Mariah, holding the baby, said nothing, because in that moment, nothing needed to be said. The child was proof, the child was truth, and the child was future. Richard dropped to his knees, his chest heaving, sobs shaking him in a way he hadn't known since boyhood. The empire he had built, the reputation he had worshipped, the pride he had guarded like gold, all of it collapsed around him. In its place, only raw humanity remained. "I have nothing left," he choked out. "Nothing, except him." And yet, in that ruin, there was a strange release. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find yourself. The air hung thick, heavy with grief and revelation. Richard's confession didn't fix the damage, didn't erase the pain, but it was the first honest step he had taken in decades. If someone you loved confessed their deepest betrayal, would you walk away, or would you try to understand the pain that drove them there? Comment your thoughts below. The truth spread faster than Richard could contain it. Within days, the carefully manicured empire he had nurtured for decades crumbled into the dust of scandal. Business partners distanced themselves, investors withdrew, and media outlets devoured every detail of his humiliation. For years, he had been a titan, commanding respect, fear, and envy. Now, he was a man stripped bare, forced to walk among the ruins of his own making. But in that downfall lived a lesson. Power without accountability destroys. Love without truth poisons. Richard had wielded both carelessly, until the mirror of his choices stared back in the form of a child who had done nothing but exist. That child had no voice, no schemes, no demands. Yet he had shattered Richard's fortress of lies simply by opening his eyes. Mariah carried herself through the storm with quiet dignity. She didn't need to raise her voice or orchestrate revenge. Her very presence was justice enough. When cameras followed her to the market, she didn't hide. When reporters shouted questions, she held her baby higher, not out of defiance, but out of pride. She was no longer invisible. She was a mother, a protector, a survivor whose truth had finally been seen. Eleanor, too, became a mirror Richard could not avoid. Betrayal etched deep scars into their marriage, but she refused to play the victim. Instead, she reclaimed her strength, refusing to let Richard's weakness define her future. Her silence became resolve, her tears hardened into boundaries, and her eyes reminded him every day of the cost of his selfishness. And Richard? He wandered through the wreckage of his legacy, stripped of titles, hollowed of arrogance, haunted by the memory of tiny fingers wrapping around his hand. He no longer commanded boardrooms. He struggled to command his own reflection. Yet within the ashes, there was something faint, something fragile. Perhaps it was the first flicker of humility. Perhaps it was the seed of redemption. Because sometimes, it takes complete ruin to force a man to see himself clearly. And Richard Hale, once untouchable, had finally been touched, by the truth he couldn't silence, by the love he had nearly destroyed, by the child who would forever be his mirror. The story doesn't end with neat forgiveness or polished reconciliation. It ends with a question, one only you can answer. What would you have done in Richard's place? Would you have denied the truth until the very end, clinging to reputation like armor? Or would you have faced those eyes staring back at you, admitting the pain, the fear, and the failure that made you human? The choice between denial and truth, between pride and humility, is a choice we all face in our own ways. And it is in those choices, not in our wealth or our power, that our true legacy is written. So I'll leave you with this. When the moment comes, and trust me, it always comes, will you protect your image, or will you face the eyes that see you for who you are? If you were standing in Richard's shoes, stripped of pride and confronted with your own reflection, Would you find redemption in the truth or cling to lies? Comment below.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, the next one will hit even deeper. It's more gripping, more unexpected, and waiting for you right now. Don't hesitate. Click the video on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.